First off, good morning, gardeners. I'm so happy that you're all here today. Thank you for joining our Sowing Circle today, which is a part of the Black Mountain Bloom Seed Lending Library. We have a full roster of workshops for you this year, so please take advantage of all that we have to offer. If you're new to our seed library, let me give you a little background. We have a unique project for the Buncombe County Library System, and it's sponsored by the Friends of the Black Mountain Library. Our seed library is nestled in the Black Mountain Library. Our motto is growing, learning, and saving. So what does that all mean? For growing, we receive donations from members, nurseries, and seed companies. In order to get these donated seeds into your hands, come to the Black Mountain Library and visit our seed table. It's free. We only ask that you have a North Carolina library card and just follow the easy instructions posted on the table. This year we have 3 full boxes of seeds. It's self-serve, so take your time and have fun going through everything. So for the learning part, we have monthly Sowing Circle workshops. Our next workshop will be about planning your vegetable garden with Master Gardener Mary Alice Ramsey. It will be on April 10th at 10 a.m. So it will be quite the treat for us to get ready to start thinking about what you're going to do with your garden. Another way to learn is through books. The library system is full of a wonderful variety of gardening books ready for you to check out. Plus, being a member of the Seed Library, we give away a gardening book each month. So, lastly, we're about saving seeds. We want you to learn how to save seeds. It is the last step in the gardening loop, and with a little prep, it's really easy to do. So if you're interested in donating to the Seed Library, just drop off your seeds to the Black Mountain Library. So on for the presentation today, we're going to do a presentation on growing root vegetables. For today's presentation, we had a change in speakers, and I'm so pleased to introduce my friend, Chris Smith. Chris is the founder of the Utopian Seed Project and loves growing and eating food. He's an author. His book, The Whole Okra, won a James Beard Award for History, Research, and Scholarship in 2020. He is passionate about sustainable food system and the heritage seed saving. So Chris, thank you so much for being here today with us, and let's all welcome him. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you for that. I think I'm just going to jump straight into my slides, and I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and the project as those pictures come up. That way you can look at the pictures and not me, which is probably better. Okay. Okay, so it's a great time of the year to be talking about root crops. We're going to be focusing on alliums, potatoes, and horseradishes, kind of like the common root crops. And then we're going to go into the and more section of this, which is the exciting work that we're doing with the Utopian Seed Project and some of the people in Western North Carolina are working on. So I'm pretty sure I'll show you something that will get you excited about trying something new this year, which is a big part of what I'm all about and the project, the Utopian Seed Project. We have about 45 minutes to go through this material, and there's a lot of different places we could go with all of these things. I was telling Lyndall that we could, I've given presentations on just potatoes for an hour and a half and still feel like we've not covered all the material. So I just want you to know that we're going to kind of be glancing at each of these things, leaving you with a few key points to get you started if you're new to this, and hopefully it can set you on the right path to growing these things. I'm not going to be able to give you all that there is to know on all of these crops because there's so many places to go, but I certainly think we can get a good start on all of those things. I just quickly wanted this picture in the background is a picture from last year's potato crop, and these potatoes were grown from actual potato seeds called true potato seeds, which is different to seed potatoes. And we'll get into that when we talk about potatoes, but I just wanted to acknowledge that the reason you're seeing all the diversity and all the different types of potatoes is because they were grown from actual tiny, tiny, tiny little potato seeds, which most people aren't growing potatoes that way. But I'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the potato section. I did kind of want to just give this overview of the Utopian Seed Project. We're a nonprofit, we're fairly young, we're in our third growing season, and we are committed to exploring diversity and biodiversity in food and farming. And it kind of informs everything that I do. And so it was pretty exciting when Linda reached out and said the and more section of this presentation was an opportunity for me to continue to talk about diversifying the food system and being able to grow a whole bunch of things. Or if we're going to grow potatoes, a whole bunch of varieties of potatoes. You know, there's a lot more to explore than the kind of centralized common crops that we tend to focus on in our current food systems. So I just wanted to throw this slide in here. This is one of the crops that we're going to get to in this picture. It's a yacon, or Bolivian sunroot, and it grows really well here as a root vegetable, which is delicious and sweet, kind of like a sweet potato, but not. We'll get to yacon, don't worry. So this quote was written by a professor from North Carolina that kind of sums up a lot of what we're doing, and it basically boils down to, if we're looking at resilient systems and sustainable systems, then we need to reintroduce more diversity than we currently see. And we can introduce that on the varietal level, on the crop level, and the farm systems level. And it's important that we tackle all three. So hopefully part of this presentation will inspire you to go out and try something new or something different in your garden this year to continue building that diverse food system in Western North Carolina and beyond. We're online, so you could all be from anywhere. Okay, so to jump straight into it, we're gonna do kind of a Potato 101 overview. We'll just probably spend 5 to 10 minutes on each of these main crops and then go through some of these exciting experimental ones at the end. And then there'll be time for questions. So there's a question and answer section on this Zoom machine that we're on. And you can just, as the presentation's going along, if you think of something or you want a clarifying question, then please drop it into that Q&A section. And I will have space at the end to answer them. We may not get to everyone's questions if there's a lot of them, but I've got some contact details for myself and some other resources to help you kind of continue your growing journey if we don't get to everything. So these are some of the main points we're going to try and cover with potatoes. Okay. I think I'm blocking my own beautiful picture. Okay, so what you see here are seed potatoes, and I've already kind of referenced that first picture that I grew potatoes from seeds, like what we think of from seeds, something that comes from a flower that sets a fruit, and inside the fruit we have a seed, right? That's what seeds are. However, most potato production, like almost all potato production, is from actual potatoes. I brought a potato. Okay, so this is a potato and we eat the potato, but we can also grow more potatoes from this potato. So it's a form of clonal propagation, which is an important thing to recognize with a lot of these root crops, is that we do clonal propagation. It's just a different way to expand and grow more food. And clonal propagation is pretty easy because everything within the potato exists for us to grow more potatoes, which is kind of exciting. It instantly raises a very important question of, can I just go to the supermarket, buy a bag of potatoes and grow a whole bunch of potatoes? And maybe you've already been looking at sourcing potatoes and you've seen this term like certified seed potatoes. And certified seed potatoes is a concept that's worth understanding. And it all comes back to the fact that these guys are clonally propagated. And so what we experience in potatoes, and actually anything that's clonally propagated, sweet potatoes and garlic are two other common crops that are clonally propagated, is we're just taking a genetic clone of the mother plant and growing something that is genetically identical. There's not been any pollination, mixing of genetics, and sexual reproduction to produce something that is unique in the child. And so because that doesn't happen, then there's no opportunity for the plant to develop and adapt naturally on its own. So what we find with crops that have been clonally propagated for a long time, as with potatoes, is that they tend to be a little more susceptible to pests and diseases. And so we have some potential bad pathogens that could find their way into our gardens if we just plant any old potato. And so that's the main reason I would say, don't go to the supermarket and buy a bag of potatoes and plant them, because there's a good chance they will grow. There's a small chance they've been sprayed with a growth inhibitor so they don't sprout in the supermarket. But if you're buying organic potatoes, there's a good chance that they will grow, but you don't know what you're introducing into your garden unintentionally. So that's where this whole term of certified seed potatoes come from. Yes, you look at the seed catalogs and you buy a pound of them and they're more expensive than a 5-pound bag of potatoes in the supermarket, but you know without a doubt that those potatoes are certified disease-free. And so you're starting off with a new, fresh crop in your garden. Now, from that point forward, I totally support the seed saving mission, and you can save your own seed potatoes by paying attention to your own disease pressures because you know the conditions they've grown in. But starting off with clean, good stock is a really good place to be. You could also do that by supporting a farmer and having a conversation with the farmer. That's the beauty of knowing your farmer, is you can like ask them what their potato selection is. Do they pay attention to diseases? Do they rotate? And some of these other questions we'll get into as we talk a bit more about potatoes. But very, very important point is make sure you're starting with good material so you're not accidentally introducing pathogens into your garden. Okay, so the next question that comes up with potatoes is, I've got my good quality potatoes from, So True Seeders in town, they sell potatoes, but there's some other places online. Lyndall's going to share a resource list that I put together with some other recommendations of places to go for good quality seed potatoes. The next question obviously is when do I plant potatoes? And we've kind of got a clue because we're talking about planting potatoes now. Now is the perfect time to plant potatoes. The memorable date that people throw out in Western North Carolina is St. Patrick's Day, so March 17th, plus or minus a couple of weeks either side of that is okay. We're kind of looking for soil temperatures around about 50-ish Fahrenheit, so that the potatoes don't just sit in the ground and kind of get damp and potentially mold once they're in the ground. That said, if anybody's grown potatoes or tried to compost potatoes in the past, they do have the ability to stay in the ground and actually continue to regrow themselves. So multiple years I've had volunteer potatoes. So you can go pretty early with planting potatoes. Now would be a perfect time. That said, the actual foliage of potatoes is frost sensitive. So if you've got lots and lots of green growth and we get a hard late frost, then that foliage can be damaged. The potato is probably big enough to regrow again, but just be aware that you don't want to, start them so early that you got these big, beautiful plants in March and April, and then we get a late April frost and they die. So we'll get to planting in our next little bit, but stick to March and you can't go too far wrong. Now, so we've got our potatoes, they're certified. We are at about the right time for planting. What do you do when you've got your bag, your 1 pound bag of potatoes? A 1 pound bag would probably do either a 12-foot row or like a 8x3 bed. That's kind of about what you're looking at in terms of volume when you're looking to purchase. There's a couple of things that need to happen. And this potato, I brought this one specifically because it's a good example. I don't know, can you see that it's sprouting? We've probably all experienced sprouting potatoes from ones that we bought and they've sprouted in the cupboard. It's actually a good thing to have a little bit of pre-sprouting. The term that you see for this is chitting. People will buy potatoes that have no sprouts on them, and then they will put them somewhere a little bit warm, in direct sunlight, And over time, then each of the little eyes on the potato that can be indistinguishable in the beginning start forming these little sprouts. Now, if your sprouts get really, really long, then they become brittle and they break off and the plant will have to regrow them. But up until about an inch long, then that's kind of a perfect pre-growth stage to get our potatoes to before putting them in the ground. So once you receive your potatoes, you can just lay them out on a worktop somewhere in the house, and they'll do a little bit of this pre-sprouting, and that's called chitting. And then we're ready to get towards our planting day. So let's say tomorrow is going to be my planting day for these potatoes. I'm going to go through all my potatoes and see that they've beautifully sprouted out. Little baby one here. And I'm going to look at this potato. It's about the size of an egg, a fairly large egg, but it's about the size of an egg. That one I'm just going to plant whole. If it's any smaller than an egg, I want to plant that whole potato without cutting it at all. But this one is a little bit bigger, and I might look at this one and go, well, it's got an eye here because it's sprouting, and on this side here, it's got a little eye. And this is a pretty big potato, like this is a goose egg. So what I could do with this potato is just take a knife and cut it in two. As long as I end up with about 2 cubed inches of potato, about the size of an egg, then that's enough potato to give the initial growth of the potato sprouts to be productive. So this is big enough that I could happily cut it in two. And as long as there's at least 1 or 2 eyes on the section that you cut, so I got 2 here and I got 2 here, then that's going to be 2 viable pieces of seed potato. And therefore I get 2 plants and more yield at the end of the harvest season. So that cutting stage happens the night before you want to plant. And the reason it's good to do it the night before, certainly in our region where it can be cool and damp, is by leaving a cut potato overnight, then it just kind of like dries over. It's like scabs over a little bit on that open section. And it's kind of like a self-healing process for the potato. And it means that it's a little less prone to rotting and like soil-borne pathogens getting into the seed potato itself. I have also, on the day of planting, been next to my garden bed, took out my potatoes from the bag, cut them and planted them straight away, and successfully grown potatoes. But as an extra secure step, you can cut it the night before and get that drying healing process just to be extra secure. So that's something you can do if you want to. So chitting to sprout them, cutting them to get your actual seed pieces ready for planting, and then you're ready to go ahead and put them in the ground. This is pretty straightforward. I like to dig a trench. So I dig 1 trench, 4 to 6 inches deep. I lay my seed potatoes out down the trench, 8 to 12 inches apart. And then I cover them back up with soil. So they've got, 3 to 4 inches on top of the seed potato of soil, lightly compact it, and then my potatoes are planted. It's really that easy. Within, 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the temperatures, you should start seeing the shoot coming through, and that's your potato plant growing. Depending how many eyes are on the potato, you'll have multiple shoots coming up, and that's okay. Potato production all comes down to how much top growth we have. If we've got these big, beautiful plants with lots of areas to photosynthesize, then we put a bunch more energy back into the ground to produce more potatoes. So that's our main aim. As it grows up to about 12 inches, what happens is we get potato production around that original seed potato and slightly above it. And if potatoes in the ground are exposed to air, to sunlight, then they will green. And once they green, those glycoalkaloids are poisonous, and you don't want to eat a green potato. So the reason we would want to just hill a little bit of soil up around the base of the plant is to protect those newly formed potatoes from being exposed to sunlight. The idea of heavily mounding a potato plant to get a higher yield all the way up the stem is actually a myth. And I have linked a really good resource that explains that myth in my resource document. We don't have time to go into it, but basically potato plants do not form potatoes all the way up their stem. They just form the stolons near the base where the original seed potato was planted. So just some light hilling to protect from sunlight is all you need. So you just do that once. One trench, plant, cover, grow up, a little bit of hilling to cover those newly formed potatoes, and then you can allow the plant to do its natural life cycle where it will grow. And I've got a picture actually of sometimes your potatoes will have this beautiful flower that looks a little bit like an eggplant flower. It's in the same family as tomatoes and eggplants. And then that flower, that's where you'll get your fruit and your seed, but you don't need to worry about that because we're concentrating on the potatoes underground. Potatoes get broken into like earlies and lates. Yukon Gold is a great example of an early that can produce in like 55 to 60 days. It kind of has this determinate type growth, so it'll grow, flower, and the whole plant will die, and then you'll dig them up and you'll have potatoes. Some of the late potatoes, like the Kennebecks, are the storage potatoes, and they have more of an indeterminate growth, so they'll continue to produce and flower and become bigger, and they will form larger potatoes over time, and you'll dig them a lot later. So when you choose your potatoes to grow, with the days to harvest, and it can be just a very simple case of tracking, like, when did I plant my potatoes? Oh, it's been 90 days. It's time to dig my red Pontiac, but I'm going to wait 100 days to dig my Kennebec. I actually made up those numbers. I don't know the numbers attached to those potatoes, but they're very readily available when you buy your potatoes. So that's the growth, is very easy stage. And depending on the potato, you're going to have that dieback, and that's when you come to harvest. Harvesting potatoes is probably one of the biggest joys, because it's kind of like digging for treasure. You know, you put a broad fork in, or just a fork a little off, and you lift the whole soil, and these, you know, depending on the color of the potato, they roll out and you gather them. It is important that sun exposure to potatoes will cause greening and that formation of the glycoalkaloids, which are poisonous. So you want to make sure you harvest your potatoes and take them out of the sun straight away. That's important. And you can leave them somewhere cool and dark to kind of do a bit of a curing process where the skin will harden up a little bit before putting them into storage. And then potatoes are like the classic root cellar crop. They like humid and cool conditions, so a basement is perfect. Airflow is useful, so I put mine in brown paper bags with some holes stabbed in my basement, but interior closets can work for a good amount of storage time. You just keep them dark so that they don't sprout and green, and then as cool as you can get, and some ambient humidity will help. So potatoes are a pretty fun crop to grow. You know, top potato growers and top performing varieties might get as much as 10 pounds per seed potato. I wouldn't expect that myself. You know, 5 pounds is considered good per plant, but less is also normal. But from a whole row, you can still get a good home yield, and potatoes are pretty fun. And there's so many varieties. One of the links I've sent you in the resource notes takes you to Wood Prairie Farms, which has a lot of different varieties to explore, so you can have a lot of fun with it. Okay. So that's a rapid overview of potatoes. Some of the seed companies that sell these seed potatoes definitely have additional resources to help you grow successfully. Do you have a question, Lyndall?
Yeah, we have a few for you. Someone wanted to know, she doesn't have too much room in her garden, but if she can grow potatoes in containers.
Good question. Yes, you can definitely grow potatoes in containers. You would effectively apply exactly the same theory. You would, let's say you've got a 5-gallon bucket, you would put a couple of inches on the bottom, maybe a bit more for root development, you know, 4 to 6 inches on the bottom of the bucket, put a piece of seed potato on top, cover it with 4 to 6 inches of soil. It'll sprout through a little bit of extra soil to cover for sun protection, and then you just let it grow, and you'd have the tuber formation in your bucket. as with most container growing, you need to be more diligent about moisture needs. It can't totally dry out, otherwise that'll impact yield. And nutrients, the potatoes aren't able to mine as many nutrients because they're contained within a bucket. And generally your yields will be lower in a container grown, but you can certainly do it. And then the larger the container, the better. The container growing potato where they have like the potato towers, that's where the things go astray a little bit. There's a lot of misinformation out there about the high yielding potential of potato towers. And again, I'll refer you to this link in the resources that has a whole myth busting documentation of the potato tower. But yes, definitely go for container grown potatoes.
Great, thank you, Chris. I have a couple more questions. Heather wants to know if they can be planted in raised beds.
Yeah. It's exactly the same theory in raised beds. I've grown raised beds a lot. As you're either going to dig your trench down in your raised bed and then cover over, or you're going to put your potatoes on the surface and cut and dig soil on top. Either way, your aim is to get 4 to 6 inches of soil on top of your potatoes, and then once they've grown, additional soil to prevent sun exposure to the forming tubers. But yeah, raised beds, row culture, containers, it's all pretty much the same theory, and they work really well in raised beds.
Great, thanks, Chris. Anne wanted to know, she saved potatoes from her crop last year. So should she go ahead and lay them at room temp now and get them to beginning to sprout before she plants them?
Yeah, I would say now is the perfect time. So dig them out of storage. If you're growing from your own potatoes, then you always want to replant the healthiest, best looking potatoes, and that's how we can kind of manage and monitor our own disease pressure and make sure that we're not developing our own diseases. And actually that reminds me, like, the critical piece of growing potatoes is I think it's Carol Deppe who says in a book, The Resilient Gardener, she has a whole awesome chapter on potatoes, and she pretty much finishes by saying all you actually need to know about growing potatoes is rotate, rotate, rotate. So that's speaking to the fact that these disease pressures can build up in the soil over time. They're in the family Solanaceae, which includes peppers, eggplant, tomatoes, tobacco, and potatoes. And you do not want to grow the same crop of a given family in the same place for between a 3 and a 5 year rotation. But with potatoes, I'm extra cautious because of these clonally produced or enhanced risk of these diseases. So continue to rotate where you plant those Solanaceae crops in a new place, and don't go back to that place for at least 3 years, which can be hard on a small scale. So that's where maybe the container growing can help you out, because you're always new in a container.
Carolyn wanted to know, does straw bale gardening work for potatoes?
Yeah, straw bale gardening is a kind of a big topic in itself with its own considerations. But if you're already an experienced straw bale gardener and you know that you need to get the straw decomposing pretty rapidly before planting so that you got access to the nutrients and that kind of thing, then straw bale can work really well because you've got a good access to nutrients. It stays quite cool and damp in the straw after it's decomposed. The only thing is to pay attention to this solar exposure. So potatoes like to form on the surface, and they send out stolons horizontally, and they in the wild are surface forming crops. They don't form tubers deep down. So when you put your seed potato into the hay bale, make sure you go in a good 6 inches, and then you may want to, as that plant grows up, add additional soil on top of the hay bale to make sure that you're not just growing a whole bunch of inedible potatoes.
We just 2 more quick questions for you. Nanette wanted to know if you recommended any fertilization.
I'm always a bad person to speak to about fertilization because I'm relatively lazy, but also I have a belief in wood chips, manure, and cover crops, and so I don't actually bring in any fertilizers to my garden apart from what I produce on site and things like the manures. So I don't fertilize my potatoes. I potentially would get higher yields if I did. Things that potatoes like are specifically potassium and phosphorus. You wouldn't want to go too high on nitrogen because it can promote like overabundance of leaf growth to the detriment of tuber formation. But yeah, definitely, you know, so, broad spectrum fertilizer that was higher in phosphorus and potassium would not harm, certainly as those plants first emerge, because they do a lot of their tuber formation early in plant emergence. So, you know, 2 to 6 weeks aside dressing of potassium phosphorus fertilizer would help you. I have occasionally, we process chickens at my homestead, and so I have occasionally done a kind of like a vinegar extract of chicken bones and use that as a foliar application for some phosphorus loving plants. I haven't done enough to actually prove whether that has increased my yields, but it can't harm to add additional phosphorus.
So what kind of numbers would we look for fertilization if she goes to the store? What do you think?
Do they not do a 10-10-5? The other way around, sorry, NPK. So they'd be a 5-10-10.
Okay.
Might be a nice, you know, lower on the nitrogen and then higher on the potassium and phosphorus.
Okay, great. And one last question. Is this all true for sweet potatoes?
No, sweet potatoes are completely different, which we will reference very briefly later on, but
okay.
Yeah, they, beyond the name potato, there is nothing that joins the potato and the sweet potato in terms of its botany or growth habits.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Okay, let's speed on to onions. Okay, so I've got some alliums to show you. Allium is the genus that encapsulates a whole range of different edible species. Onions is the one that's kind of relevant to planting now, but I do want to show you some of the other ones because I think there's some great alliums out there. Onions kind of get a little bit of a bad rap for growing because they can be a little tricky, but really it's down to timing. Onions are relatively easy to grow if you time it right and you choose the right variety. And I actually believe that's maybe the bigger problem. So we'll go through each of these things, but it's kind of like the same thought process as we had for the potatoes is where do I start? What if I want to grow onions, where do I start? You're going to see a lot of actual seeds for sale. If you're going to start onions from seeds, then you're already too late in this region. A bulbing onion, sorry, like what the picture we see on the right, if you want to start a bulbing onion from seed, you're already too late, because about mid-March is the time that you want to be transplanting onions that are about the size of the picture you see on the left. So in general, we say kind of like pencil thick transplants around about the middle of March. So the picture on the left, you're seeing somebody else has started those seeds probably the end of December, beginning of January, and they've started them in flats inside, and they've grown them to that size to then pull them all up, put them in bundles of 25 and allow you to buy transplants. And then, so you've skipped the whole seed starting stage and somebody else has done it for you. So it's kind of like buying a tomato transplant in May that somebody else started 8 weeks before. That's exactly what's happening here with onions. So if you want to grow onions this year, this is what you need to find. You need to find some transplants that are available. I do know that SoTruSeed sells them. I don't know if they're still available. You know, a lot of people are getting into home gardening right now, so some of the supply is a little limited, but check them out. Garden centers often have them this time of year. So just call around, check around, and see if you can get them. But that's definitely what you're looking for at this point. The third, so seed next year, start much earlier. This year, try and find some of these. The third option you may see are these bags of onion sets. And onion sets are just dormant, small onion bulbs that have been forced to go dormant and then bagged up and sold. I've never grown from sets, but this is my understanding. Most people struggle to grow large bulbing onions from sets because most onion set production is with long day varieties. And so that's the next question we need to tackle, is when we're looking at the type of onion we need to grow, we will see this descriptor of short day versus long day. And that's critically important. And that's because we need to think about onions having like two growth phases. And actually, alliums in general tend to have these two growth phases. One is the vegetative growth, where they put on all their green matter above the ground. And then at a certain point, they switch to bulb formation. And the thing that triggers the change from vegetative growth above ground to bulb formation underground is the amount of available daylight hours. And so we have lots of different onion varieties, and that trigger time is at all sorts of different numbers of hours. We have some that trigger bulb formation when there's 10 hours of available daylight, and we have some that trigger when there's 16 hours of available daylight. So in general, we split that into long day varieties, which is kind of like varieties that trigger at 14 to 16 hours, short day varieties, which trigger at kind of like 10 to 12 hours. And then there's this kind of like indeterminate middle, where it's kind of like it could go either way. So I tell you all that because where we live at our latitude, we don't experience 16 hours of daylight. So if we're planting a variety of onion that doesn't start bulb formation until we have 16 hours of daylight, we'll never get bulb formation because we don't experience the trigger. So that long day varieties are grown up north, where they have much longer summers because they're further from the equator. The closer to the equator we get, the more standardized 12-hour days we get. So don't plant long day varieties is the short way of saying this. We're in a place where we are further enough north that we can plant some of these intermediate varieties, but we can definitely plant short day varieties and be successful because we're going to trigger this bulb formation at the right time of the year. So pick a short day variety and know that our aim is to get as much vegetative growth as possible before it switches to bulb formation, which is why if you were to start seeds today and grow them, you'd get these little baby onion plants growing, and then they'd hit that right amount of day length and start bulb formation as a tiny plant. And a tiny plant will produce a tiny bulb. If you want to get the nice big bulbing onions, you need to have a nice big onion plant, which means you need to start really early, which is why you, at this point in time, you need to start the transplants. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for failure. So that's kind of, I think that covers the main reasons people struggle with onions, is they start too late from seed, and they don't get big enough plants before that daylight trigger, or they're growing long day varieties and they're never going to succeed. So that's kind of important. Specific varieties that I like, Texas Early Grano is a good one. Red Creole is a good one as a red variety. I want to show you another book. This is Ira Wallace's book that she wrote specifically for North Carolina. It's a really good all-round vegetable book. And she gives a lot of her favorite varieties in this, and she covers potatoes and onions and many other vegetables. So that's kind of a real good go-to guide because it's so specific to North Carolina. And yeah, just make sure you got the timing right and the right variety, and I think you'll have a lot more success with onions. To kind of just give you a very brief overview of the cycle is you can expect to be harvesting these onions, early to midsummer, depending on their days to maturity. Kind of like the potatoes, we do have like different lengths of time to get to maturity. You know that they're ready to harvest when about half of the leaves of the onions have kind of collapsed over. You can kind of see it a little bit in this picture of my hand with this bunch of onions. Is some of those leaves, that's not harvest damage you're seeing where they've flopped over like this. That's the tell when you know that your onions are ready to harvest, is they actually start falling over, because they're putting less thought into their leaves and more into the bulb formation. So when about half of them are falling over, pretty good to go for harvest. You harvest all these onions. They like going through a curing process like many of the other alliums. So putting them somewhere where it's warm and well ventilated, out of direct sunlight. And what happens is the stem dries down and the onion pulls in a lot of nutrients. So once the whole green leaves have gone all completely crispy and crunchy, then you're ready to kind of, you can braid them and hang them up somewhere cool and dry and have them as storage onions. A lot of the short day varieties don't store as well as those long day varieties. So I tend to use them in like summer salsas and that type of thing, and put them into like preservation places instead of having a real long storage onion. That's kind of harder to achieve. So that's my whistle stop of onions. Do you want to do questions on onions now, and then I'll...
Yes.
The rest of it's less explaining and more showy, so we can whistle through some of the other stuff.
Okay, great. Well, we've got a question from Sandra. She wants to know if this applies to growing shallots.
Oh, so some of my next pictures are of those varieties. Some of it applies to growing shallots in that the basic life cycle of needing to put on green growth prior to bulb formation, which is triggered by daylight, those types of things are the same. Shallots you would have to plant in the fall in this region to get enough of a head start to have reasonable sized bulb formation for harvest in June-ish in this region. So kind of, but not really.
Okay, that's great. And just a quick question off subject is, will you also discuss parsnips?
I am not getting into any of the annual roots. So like beets, parsnips, carrots, I am not getting into today.
Okay.
Although parsnips is one of the few vegetables I actually don't like eating, but the beets are one of my favorites. So so no, sorry, we're not going to do that one today.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chris. That's it.
Okay. Where's my horseradish? Did I lose it? Oh no, I know where I am. The three specific vegetables I asked for was the potatoes, the onions, and the horseradish. So I am going to do horseradish briefly, and then we'll do the interesting tropicals. But I did want to do, this is just a visual go through of alliums, because I think it's kind of interesting to see. I'm almost certain that all allium species are edible, and there's so much diversity there that it's pretty fun. So you don't have to limit yourself to onions. This is just going to be a walkthrough, okay? So garlic is obviously one, fall planted. You get the spring escapes. Elephant garlic grows these massive cloves, beautiful flower that could almost be an ornamental. It's actually a bulbing leek, which you can see in the leaf formation there, fall planted. So you can start dreaming for fall already. These are the shallots. There's a few different species within shallots. There's gray shallots, red shallots, the yellow Dutch shallots, fall planted again. They're kind of very closely related to, that's the gray shallot, closely related to these potato onions. Potato onions have kind of like a longer history in America, and they form these clumping, sometimes called multiplier onions, where you can just keep planting and replanting and expanding the crop. Edible tops that you can snip off like a spring onion, and then obviously a great harvest underneath. The bulbs sometimes get a little bit bigger. That's one of the complaints with shallots, is they're so small and fiddly to harvest, but they're so pungent and delicious that it's kind of worth it. So, but potato onions are there as an option. Southern Exposure sell these guys. Egyptian walking onions are a perennial allium that form these alien Medusa-like heads, which are delicious, and you can pickle them. So I'm a big fan of Egyptian walking onions. they are also fall planted, but you can transplant them in the spring as well and grow them more like an annual for like a spring green cutting. So you could play around with that if you can find somebody with Egyptian walking onions. There's just more Egyptian walking onions because they're awesome. And then chives are a perennial. Again, they just keep coming back and they're delicious. In another allium, Chinese chives or garlic chives. Totally different species, still an allium, but they have the garlic flavor, beautiful white flower. Mine are already sprouting up in my garden, so I've already got something I can go out and cut and dice into an omelet. So that's pretty exciting. What have we got here? This is a perennial leek. So instead of going to the struggle of growing leeks, which have some of their own challenges, this is a perennial leek coming back, kind of like a multiplier onion, but for leeks. So pretty exciting. And then horseradish. So lots to go at with alliums, which was the main purpose of showing you all those different things. You don't necessarily need to be locked in to just growing onions or traditional onions. Okay, so horseradish. This will not take long because horseradish is very, very easy to grow. It's another clonally propagated vegetable, root crop and you propagate it from the root. It's actually got roots that go down below, and then this is kind of like an enlarged stem that we're seeing here. And so you can kind of see them, you can't see my finger pointing at it, but along the root you can kind of see kind of barky-like nodules-ish. That's what will sprout new growth. So when you buy horseradish or you have a friend that's got horseradish and you just hack off a piece of it with a spade, and as long as you're capturing one of these fatter root sections with some of those kind of barky-like points, then that's going to resprout. And so you can take a very small section of horseradish, but if you take a reasonable section of horseradish and dig a nice hole where it's going to go in the garden, and they'll grow in pretty tough, they'll pretty much grow anywhere, but if you give it some nice fertile soil, amend with a little bit of compost and organic matter, there's a lot of sources that say you should plant it at a 45-degree angle, and that's really just to stop it kind of rotting out and make sure that you get root growth down and sprouting up. But in general, the horseradish will sort itself out. But to ensure success, you could go ahead and put it in about 2 inches underground. So you want about 2 inches of soil on top of where you plant. And then this is something else that can be done right now. So we're kind of at a March perennial vegetable planting stage. So go ahead and source some horseradish. Again, I don't work at Sow True Seed anymore, so I'm not up on it all, but they certainly supply horseradish. I don't know if they've still got it in stock, but you should be able to find it from a store, or what's better, find a friend that has some, because one thing that's really important to pay attention to with horseradish is it just spread horizontally and continue to send up new shoots to the point that some people would say it's kind of aggressively invasive and would recommend not putting it in a vegetable garden where it could compete with other vegetables. You can see this is my planting. We've got cabbage in the foreground, Swiss chard in the background, and then I have between my raised beds, that's where I planted the horseradish. And I dig it up and I use it. I make horseradish sauce every year and use it I infuse it into vinegar. It's a potent medicinal. So I control it by harvesting it, but it's one of those ones a bit like comfrey that when you dig it up, if you cut off a root fragment and leave it in the ground, then effectively that's going to be a new plant next year. So that's why it becomes hard to control, because it keeps spreading out these underground roots that keep resprouting, kind of like you cut off its head and two more will grow sort of theory. So that's why people are a little cautious about horseradish, and why a lot of people will grow horseradish in a large container. So it's like mint. People will grow mint in a large container or in a part of their garden that they don't mind it kind of taking over to some extent. But it's a very pretty plant, very easy to grow and very easy to propagate. Any horseradish questions?
Well, I have a horseradish question.
Yeah.
I have it in my garden, and yes, if anybody wants some, let me, because I have a ton of it. When do you harvest it?
Oh, once I let mine go a couple of years before I started harvesting. Although in hindsight, you could harvest earlier. If you harvest earlier, then what you're getting is much thinner roots, which I like to peel my horseradish when I use it in sauce. And so if you peel a thin root, then you don't end up with much mass at the end. So if you let it go a couple of years before harvesting, then you're going to get much fatter roots. I like to harvest in fall when it's kind of like at that maximum point of drawdown. But I've heard of people harvesting it like year round, basically. There's probably some information out there that I don't know about when it's most potently medicinal. Maybe I can look that up and include it in the resources. But I'm pretty mean to my horseradish. I just dig it up whenever I want horseradish, and it's one of those plants that can take it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I'm going to do that this afternoon then. Margaret wanted to know what part of the horseradish is harvested.
Oh, that's a good question. The leaves are actually listed as edible in some resources. They kind of got the same wasabi-esque flavor. Interestingly, most wasabi in this country is horseradish that's being colored green, but that's the horseradish root. So people harvest the root and use that. And you'll need to look up processing it. It's really, really powerful. So if you were to put it with a little bit of vinegar and salt in a blender and blend it, then the fumes that come off that can kind of like, if you breathe them in, they can take you out. They have taken me out. I've been like on the floor coughing my lungs up because this horseradish is just so pungent. So be a little bit cautious about that when you're processing it. But if you look up any horseradish recipe, there's always this warning that says, don't put your face in the blender. So I put my face in the blender, obviously, and learned it the hard way. But super delicious, super delicious.
Okay, so then what people would do is they would dig it up, hack off a piece of the root, and then they can just replant it.
As it starts spreading, then I don't think you even need to replant it. So this plant here is growing like this. It's got its nice leaves. I might just take a spade on like a side third of it and just hack right down, and I'll end up with a chunk of it. And then there might be some of the thinner roots that I might propagate out for sharing, but the fattest, chunkiest slice of that is what I would peel and process for cooking. So it just continues to create this like underground mass. And I feel the biggest challenge is just trying to hack off a section that is easier to process. You can even see from this picture on the left that it's, it's kind of gnarly and wrinkly and it just, but also you get so much of it that I'm not that worried about waste. You could take a knife to this, because obviously a peeler wouldn't work, and just cut off the side section so you're left with a nice smooth white section and use that in your sauce. So it's not like you're serving this like potatoes. You're only using a small amount of it to make a condiment in the most cases. But yeah, just get a spade and just hack off a section and leave the rest, and it'll continue growing. It's really, really straightforward.
That's great. Well, that's it, Chris.
Cool. So I'm going to use my final short amount of time to kind of like the Alliums. We're just going to whiz through some stuff. Know that all these things I have grown and am growing in Western North Carolina. So this is the type of thing that if you see something and you're like, I really want to know more about that, then come and check out the Utopian Seed Project and get in touch, and we can talk more for sure. Okay. Tropical perennials as temperate annuals is what we are calling this focus area that we're working on. It's kind of interesting because I'm predicting at some point in the future, growing potatoes in Western North Carolina will not be overly agronomic because of the warming climate. And yet all these tropical perennials are designed to grow in hot and humid conditions. They thrive in those conditions, and they don't currently have the same pest or disease pressure as we experience with things like potatoes. So these could be the crops of the future. Plus they're exciting, biodiversity, etc. There's a lot of culture that goes with these. So as we see migrating people as well, then we're going to see changes in food systems, I think, sadly, potentially in the not too near future. Okay, so this is one of my board members holding ube, which is the true yam. It's this purple all the way through, a really fun crop. I usually start this off. This is a field of sweet potatoes, and just tropical perennials grown as temperate annuals feels like a scary term, but just know that sweet potatoes are a tropical perennial that we grow as a tropical perennial that we grow as a temperate annual. We've just learned how to grow them in our region as an annual, even though botanically and culturally they came as a tropical perennial. So we dig up the roots every year, and then in April time, we take the roots and we sprout out slips from the sweet potato, and then we pinch off those slips and we plant the slip, and that slip produces a new sweet potato plant. So we treat it as an annual, even though it's technically a perennial. And that theory is applied to all these other crops in different ways. So we're not going to get time to really go deep into sweet potatoes, but for the person that was asking about potatoes and sweet potatoes are grown from sweet potato slips, and they are highly frost sensitive and would not be planted until late May. So you've got some time to research and think about the sweet potato question. Beautiful amount of diversity in sweet potatoes. This is we grew about 33 different varieties last year. Massive color spectrum and all the phytonutrient profiles that goes along with them. So you can do a lot of fun exploration with sweet potatoes. It's also North Carolina's state vegetable. This is just a little bit for the Utopian Seed Project. We always do taste testing on everything. I think flavor is important. Okay, so the tropical perennials. Turmeric, beautiful amount of color diversity here. We're also growing a green turmeric this year, and it started flowering for us. So we maybe get seed production from the turmeric, but that's certainly a good one to go at if you're interested in the medicinals. This is the green turmeric up here in the corner. It's kind of contrasted out, but it's this really beautiful green color. So a lot of beauty in growing turmeric. Taro is a crop that we're really excited about. I brought one to show you. You get these awesome, this is the mother of the taro plant that grows in the center, and you get little edos growing off it. It's tasty, it's delicious. There's, you know, cultures all across the tropics that have been growing this for a long time. The greens are edible when cooked. In fact, both need to be cooked. And it's like one of the primary greens of Ghana. So there's some good culture there for eating and growing taro. So that's Colocasia esculenta. I don't know if you can see my picture down here, but I'm in the way of, I'm going to put myself up there. Okay, so it looks like elephant's ears. It is, but the edible ones have been developed for low calcium oxalates. So don't just go into your garden and eat an ornamental Colocasia. Source one that's edible. And again, if you're interested, talk to us. We've got a few different varieties we're working with. I'm always in the way of myself. Okay, this is taro showing how big it can get. So a beautiful landscaping plant is pretty exciting for something to grow. And then some of the varieties we're working with, there's a few different colors and that kind of thing. So taro is one of our current most promising tropical perennials we're working with, and we're starting to do bigger grow outs and going to try and get it into more restaurants and farmers markets and that type of thing. Achiera is an Andean root crop. There's quite a few different Andean root crops. Good starch production. Again, culinary traditions to go with it. It's a canna, so this is canna edulis, but it looks like canna indica, which you've probably seen growing as a landscaping feature around here. Big, beautiful, dramatic plants that you see on the right, and then these really pretty looking root crop on the left. So very big biomass production here. Again, it could just be a landscaping crop, but then we get the bonus of a large edible crop at the end of the season. So that's Achiera. Yacon is a fun one that we're working with. It's in the sunflower family, and it produces these, after they've cured, a sweet, looks like a sweet potato. It's not. It's kind of juicy, a bit more like a sweet Jerusalem artichoke, but much larger. So you get these big crops. there's somebody breeding these for different cultivars and varieties and better production in North America, but we've had good success growing these, and are starting to grow a few different varieties. So Yacon, again, another beautiful landscaping plant with big tuber production. This is the plant above ground. We had it flowering for us last year, which was the first time it had flowered. Tiny little sunflower type flowers. It's really pretty. Water chestnuts grow here. So if you're into aquatic edibles, and there's a lot of aquatic edibles, but this is one that we've been working with a few different cultivars from the USDA. We've grown them in ponds, in containers. They need to be grown submerged, but they do grow well. They're like in the sedge family, so they've got kind of like this grass-like above ground look. Some different growing systems that we've used, and a fresh water chestnut is like, it's like eating your first heirloom tomato. It's nothing like a canned water chestnut. It's kind of a juicy, coconutty deliciousness. So I'm enjoying the water chestnuts. It's actually flowered for us, but I've not managed to harvest seed. And then some variety tasting on the water chestnuts. We started in on dahlia tubers last year, another sunflower family root tuber production. So now we have like sunchokes as the native, dahlias, yacon, all have these kind of similar high inulin, crunchy, edible when raw roots that can be used for a few different things. Plus the dahlias are actually beautiful plants above ground. This was the diversity that we had in floral production. And then we did a whole bunch of flavor evaluations to find higher productivity and good flavor on the roots. And we, as part of the Utopian Seed Project, we're documenting all of this stuff and bringing on the better cultivars to go forward. So we narrowed 62 different dahlias down to about 12 that we're going to grow out on a bigger scale this year to continue that work of hopefully more widely distributing dahlias that can be used as an edible food crop. And then just a couple to finish on, and I know we're past 11, I apologize for that. We have the American groundnut, which is a wild harvested native edible that's had some breeding work to increase tuber size. So this has like 3 times the protein of the potato and is native to this region. So it's got quite a lot of potential that we're working with there. So the groundnuts are very exciting. Here's one of the biggest specimens. That's one of the limiting factors at the moment, is in the wild, they're tiny, but the breeding work has helped get them much larger. Okay. So there's so many more root crops, like literally so many more root crops. I wanted to share this last book with you. This is one of my favorites at the moment. This is written from a culinary perspective, but it covers a lot of what we're growing, which is kind of an exciting kind of mirror. We're learning how to grow them and then working with some chefs to eat them. But this book really goes deep into a lot of them. But there really are hundreds of root crops, and because they store, they're pretty easy to propagate forward and work with as a food crop. So the Utopian Seed Project is a nonprofit. We have a Patreon to help get community support, or if you're just interested in knowing more or volunteering or whatever, then we have a Get Involved page on our website. So you can take note of that. And then I've got a final slide with a little bit more information. First, about the Utopian Seed Project. If you want to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, our URL will take you to more resources about what we're all up to. And then there's me on Instagram. Oh, and the Okra Podcast. I'm a bit crazy about okra. You should get me back to talk about okra. So I obviously wrote the book, The Whole Okra, but we've recently launched an Okra Podcast, so you can check that out too if you are also in love with okra. So that's most of my content, apart from the resources that Lyndall will share with you by email, but I'm happy to answer any lingering questions. Lyndall, you're muted.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we do have a few more questions for you. Anne wanted to know if leeks were similar to onions.
In terms of growth?
Yes.
Yeah, so they're similar to onions in that you would need to start the seeds in January to get the pencil size transplants by March to transplant around about the same time. So their kind of life cycle is similar in that regard. once they actually start growing, they're a little bit different in harvest. And I quickly said they're annoying to grow. The reason they're annoying to grow is because they've got a tendency to create or to grow a really tough interior stalk if they experience, and I forget this, I don't grow leeks very often, but it's either they have like a warm patch followed by a rapid cold temperature, or a cold patch followed by a rapid warm temperature. One of those two conditions, which we experience both ways regularly in an average Western North Carolina spring, induces the leeks to produce this tough woody core, which makes it less of a desirable vegetable in my mind. So they prefer like consistent, cool spring temperatures. And as we're experiencing right now, we have these warm spells all the time, which kind of throws leek for the loop, and it makes them just more challenging to grow in that regard. But in terms of starting them, that you would follow the same pattern as the onion: early seeds in January or transplants in March.
Okay, great. Well, we have a few questions about turmeric. Jill wanted to know where to get turmeric and ginger to plant.
Yeah, those are the two tropical perennials as temperate annuals that have probably been around the longest, and so people are getting more excited about growing them. It's kind of more of a proven entity. So a lot of the turmeric in this area is imported from Hawaii. So you can get stuff from, there's a guy that calls himself the biker dude that you buy it from in Hawaii, and he will ship. Quite a few nurseries these days are selling turmeric starts in, by the time we get to May, they'll sell little turmeric and ginger plants as transplants. I think Fifth Season were doing that last year. So True Seed has done that for a couple of years. So that can be a nice way if you just want to do a couple of plants, because they're very, very slow to start from the actual root. We're bedding in our turmeric now, and they need to be kept very warm, and then they will sprout and grow, and we'll expect transplanting by May. So pretty slow. Turmeric is one that if you can, there's quite a lot of local farmers growing it now. So if you can find a local farmer selling turmeric, then you should be able to sprout that turmeric that they've grown. And I would do the same thing, the same due diligence as you do with any other thing you're buying from the farmer's market that you want to grow, is just asking them, how are they growing it? Are they spraying it? Some of these common questions to make sure that you're getting clean, disease-free starting stock. And then I would have the same hesitation of starting grocery store bought turmeric or ginger, even though it might sprout for you. You don't know where it's come from, and the reality is most of it's probably been imported internationally. Okay. So, yeah.
Boone wanted to know if you've had any luck growing ginger. Mm-hmm. He said they seem pretty similar to turmeric, but it doesn't do as well. But ginger doesn't do that well for him.
Yeah, one thing they're both quite heavy feeders, so that's one thing for both of them. If you want to get higher yields, then they do need supplemental fertilizing. The other thing with ginger is it does appreciate a little bit of shade. So I tend to grow my ginger like on the north side of my taro, because the taro gets nice and tall and provides shading for the shorter ginger plants. It doesn't like the same full sun exposure in the way that turmeric doesn't seem to mind being in the full sun. It almost seems to enjoy it and gets these big, beautiful, wide leaves. But the ginger, I think, appreciates a little bit of shading. So shading and fertilizing is probably the two things that might make you more successful with ginger.
Okay, and Diana wanted to know what's the best type of soil for turmeric. Would coy be good?
Coy? Is that what?
Yeah, the soil is mixed.
Okay, bearing in mind that they like to have the higher nutrient need, then I would definitely cut it with some, well finished compost. I'm doing all of my stuff in field culture, so we've been doing a top dress, and we're not tilling at the moment. So we're in a pretty good rotation of cover crops to kind of like give us nitrogen in the soil, and then top dressing with a well-finished manure, and then planting into that. So whatever soil mix you use, if you're going to do it in containers, then making sure that it's something that there's some good like organic mushroom composts at the moment that I like, that just give like kind of broad spectrum fertility over time, I think would be important for the turmeric. And I have noticed nitrogen deficiencies because it's in the ground for so long. It's a long season crop. So like come September, when I'm wanting it to grow as far as possible into October, I've noticed that you get like yellowing on the leaves through nitrogen deficiency. So potentially some late season fish emulsion type of applications, I think, could help it, give it that last little boost as well.
Okay. Sandra wanted to know, where do you buy water chestnut starts?
Oh, I've no idea. We started our water chestnuts from material that we pulled out of the USDA gene banks, which is something that's technically available to anybody, but they do ask for a research or an education reason for using the USDA's. It's kind of like an open access plant repository. I've spoken to a lot of people that have grown, like just bought freshwater chestnuts from Asian supermarkets and grown them. Same kind of generic warning. I would try and have a conversation about where they got them from, and if they've been brought in from who knows where, then I would be a little cautious about growing them. So that's one that we feel like we're in early stages of trialing the water chestnuts, and we're going to try and put some into field production this year to see if we can grow them in like semi-dry conditions. And if we can prove some of the agronomics, then we will hopefully hook them up with a farmer, and then hopefully we'll start seeing them in farmers markets, and then we can filter down to home gardeners as well. The Utopian Seed Project does distribute some plant material. We don't really have the capacity to be a supplier, but through the Patreon platform and then through some growing partner platforms, then we do some distribution. So it's worth getting in touch with us and saying, I can only say no, and I would only say no because we don't have enough of something, or we're limited by capacity, than because I'm mean. So feel free to reach out and we'll see what we can do.
We have a taste testing question. Margaret wanted to know if for garlic chives, if they taste like leeks.
No, not really. The garlic chives, they're called Chinese chives as well. I think they got called garlic chives because they taste more like garlic. It's kind of funny, if you put chives next to garlic chives, then the chives taste and smell a bit oniony, and the garlic chives taste and smell a bit garlicky.
Well, that was the end of our questions. We've got Sandra and Renee wanted to thank you so much for the presentations, because they were really, really good and they've learned a lot.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank you, Chris, for coming on today. And as usual, you're always giving us so much good information, and I can't wait to go out and harvest that horseradish this afternoon and put some potatoes in.
Yeah, it's time.
It is time. And like we said before, all the reference material that Chris has put up regarding the books and the information he's got about the Utopian Seed Project will be sent out to you hopefully today, if not tomorrow morning. So you all have that information. Lastly, I just wanted to mention, if anybody is interested in our April 10th workshop on planning your vegetable garden, just please register online at the Black Mountain Library events page. We only allow for 100 Zoom seats, so please register early. And lastly, what you've learned today is some great knowledge about root vegetables, and also go to the Black Mountain Blooms seed table at the Black Mountain Library. There's tons of seeds. And, this is a free project, and it's up to all of you to get in there and do it and garden and grow something different this year. Okay, guys, thanks so much for being a part of this today. We really appreciate it.